Today, we're going to talk about virtue ethics. And we're talking about Aristotle in particular, but virtue ethics more generally. Virtue ethics is an older and very different approach to ethics. I think it's an incredibly intriguing approach to ethics. If you've been thinking as we go through this section on ethics, and we're talking about what's right and wrong and whether how you should act in a particular situation, you might have been thinking, maybe even unconsciously, this feels a little superficial. At least, if you weren't thinking that, it might also be because you've gotten into class mode, you've kind of bought into the assumptions of the course, and you've said, this is superficial, or some part of your brain has said, this is superficial, but I'm going to go along with the course material. But when you really think about what makes someone a good person, what makes a life good, and how you ought to be orienting yourself, you might think, doesn't it have a lot more to do with your character? Isn't your character traits maybe, aren't those really important, and maybe even more important than talking about what we should do in one situation or another? After all, talking about what we should or shouldn't do, what's right or wrong to do, really just touches the surface level of our action, and more fundamental to our being are our character traits. Virtue ethics is sort of trying to get at that, and because it's an older approach to ethics, you might think that the story of ethics, historically speaking, and I'll just throw this out there for your ponderings, the story of ethics, if this is right, if you're convinced by this, might be a story of the corruption of ethics. That we had it right before, and over time we started talking more and more superficially about ethics and less about character. Okay, so let's talk about virtue ethics, about virtues as character traits, and about what those virtues might be. So I want to start out talking about two cases. Here's the first case. Consider Bob and Barbara. Bob is truly generous. He gives to charity with an open heart, and he enjoys seeing his money used by others. Okay, we'll talk about why it is that that's true generosity more later on. But Barbara was raised by two penny pinchers. This is sort of my story, and has been convinced that she ought to give to charity. And so she does it, but only with difficulty. So she was raised by cheapskates, and then later in life, maybe in an ethics course, I don't know, was convinced that she should give to charity. And so she does it because she's convinced that she ought to, but it's very hard for her because her instincts, everything about her says you need to save all the money you can. Don't even spend it on yourself, much less other people. So she doesn't enjoy giving her money away. It's very hard for her, but she forces herself to do it because she's convinced that it's the right thing to do. So here's a question. Who do you think is the better person, Bob or Barbara? Are you better when you really want to do the thing you ought to do and you enjoy doing it? Or are you better when you force yourself to do it against your instincts, so to speak? Okay, here's a second case. We'll talk more about that case. I'm not just going to leave you hanging on that. Here's a second case. Here's a headline. I screamed, but there was nothing to hear. Man trapped in 23-year coma reveals horror of being unable to tell doctors he was conscious. That is a horror story. That is nightmare fuel. That he was trapped in a coma and he could give no indication whatsoever, be it blinking or twitching or anything, that he was conscious, but he was conscious the whole time. So he could hear everybody talking in his room, talking about him as they're talking about him being in a coma. They're talking as if he can't hear. This is the guy's name, Rob Huben. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Now, here's a question about this. He was in this coma for 23 years. Now, he did eventually come out, right? Obviously, because he was able to tell us, I screamed, but there was nothing to hear. And that may change things for you. But here's the question. Should a person in this situation, in the midst of a coma, they are conscious but can do nothing, can signal nothing, can say nothing, should they be cultivating a generous spirit, or the virtue of generosity, you might say? Is he a better person the more generous spirit he has. So that's another question to consider. And if it makes a difference to you, you can also consider the question of whether someone who is never going to come out of such a coma, they're going to die unable to move or signal or talk, but they were conscious the whole time. This might be an even harder question, because at least Huben is going to come out of the coma and be able to practice generosity. But we can ask the even harder question of whether it makes sense, whether that person that's never going to come out of that coma but will be conscious should be trying to cultivate generosity. What does it mean to cultivate generosity when you can't do anything? Well, it's true that generous actions are part of generosity, but it's also true, as we'll talk in more in depth, that it kind of seems like in order to be generous, you kind of have to have certain things happening on the inside. You want to give your money away. You're looking for opportunities to. And now if you're conscious, you can have all of that inner experience aspect of generosity, even though you can't give anything away, right? And so maybe you had some sort of will, or you had some sort of legal thing written up that said, if I'm ever in a coma, my possessions will be used in this way. And maybe it says that they, any excess will go to my children or will go to this charity or something like that. And a generous person would not be able to do anything, but in observing or in hearing that that's being done in their hotel room or hospital room or whatever, or maybe they're at home, would be happy that that money is doing that. They'd be happy when their medical expenses are lower so that more of that money can be carried over to charities or to their children or to their grandchildren or whatever. So that's what generosity would look like. And now the question is it good? Is it a trait of a good person to be cultivating that sort of generosity on the inside, even though they can't do anything? Okay, so those are your two cases. Now, about these two cases, let's discuss them in more detail. Virtue ethicists, now, if you found yourself in the first case saying, I think Bob is the better person, the virtue ethicist is going to say the same thing. That's the sort of intuition that they're relying on here. That's the thought, is that, well, of course, Bob is a better person. It's better for you to love doing the good thing rather than to hate doing the good thing. Doesn't that just seem obvious? You're a better person when you love doing what you should do, as opposed to hating doing it, but making yourself do it, right? And in the second case, they're going to say, well, of course he should try to be cultivating a generous spirit. Of course, it won't be perfect generosity because he can never act on it. Or, assuming that he's not going to come out of the coma, counterfactually to this case. But it's still good to be generous. There's still goodness in that. You're a better person. You're doing what you should be doing, how you should be living, insofar as you try to cultivate these character traits. Not to say that it's going to be easy. You're probably going to deal with severe depression, cynicism, and things like that. But you should be aiming for that cultivation. Okay, so what does all that tell us? Well, it tells us that there are things that are important about how we should live and what a good person looks like that go beyond mere superficial action described in sort of external terms. That is, he went there, he gave this money to this person, right? There are things that determine the moral worth of a person that go beyond that, goes to their thoughts, their desires, their hopes, their fears, things like that. That can all go into the evaluation of a person and their character, right? So what that tells us is we need to talk about those things when we talk about what it looks like to be a good person, to live a good life. We need to talk about all those complex character traits or aspects of character traits. And what virtue ethicists say is that's just what a virtue is. A virtue is a complex character trait. It encompasses your values, your desires, your pleasures, your beliefs, your hopes, your choices, your reactions even. Okay, that's what a virtue is. To have a single virtue is to have a trait that governs all of those aspects of your character, right? And so you might think, for example, if we take one virtue such as generosity, you might think, well, look, what's generosity? It's just giving to people that need it, giving freely of your resources, right? Being willing to give people your resources when they need them more than you, or maybe even less than you. I don't know. And it's just a habit of doing that. That's what generosity is, when you're willing to do that. But what Aristotle would say, and what virtue ethicists, people working in his tradition, say, is that that's not all it takes to be generous. I mean, look at Bob and Barbara. You would not call Barbara generous, even though she's giving lots of things away. She hates doing it. It's not part of her character, really. She just does it against everything she wants and believes and takes pleasure in. She wishes she didn't have to do it, right? It's a pain for her to do it. But the truly generous person, generosity is going to pervade all of these aspects of their character, right? So not only do you give away of your resources regularly, habitually, but you value the benefit of others. That's something you value. You think it's valuable that others be benefited, right? So imagine a person without that. They don't think it's valuable at all, but they've been sort of programmed by some computer chip in their brain to give away their resources. You wouldn't call that person generous. They're just giving their stuff away. They're not generous. They don't value the benefit of other people. They desire, for example, that there's probably lots of different desires and values and pleasures and stuff that they have. I'm just giving you one example of each. They desire that others have enough resources. The truly generous person, imagine this, there is a freeze in Texas, right? Where it snows, everything freezes, the power goes out, a lot of people's water goes out, and everyone is stuck in their houses, at least everyone that doesn't have a four-wheel drive. It's actually smarter for everybody to stay in their houses. There will be less injuries that way. So what's happening on the inside of a house in one sense is the same for everybody. But in another sense, it could be different for different people, because assume two households and they both, are doing well. They have enough food and water, but the people in one household are in pain for those people outside who don't have what they need. They can't go out, but it hurts them. They want those people to have enough resources, and it hurts them that they don't. Whereas on the other hand, the other household, they're not thinking about that. They're very satisfied that they're doing well, and they're not concerned at all. They don't have any desires for other people to be doing well, right? So there's no difference in action. There's a difference in the desire. The first household wants people and is pained by people not having what they need, and the second is not. That's a difference in generosity, even though there's no difference in how they're acting. So a generous person is pleased. They take pleasure when they see someone come into resources that they need, right? Think about this. Have you ever experienced this? This like true, again, most people, it's sort of their peaks of character that they get to experience this when they're on the mountaintop. You don't get to experience this very often because most people are not truly virtuous. But when you can really experience having great deep pleasure that someone else is being benefited, even when you're not. Imagine in the extreme case, imagine someone else getting the benefit that you would otherwise get if they didn't. A really generous person would even be happy for that person, be pleased in that situation. So if you're competing for a job, you both need a job, right? I was in this situation, competing with some of my friends for different jobs, and I had to practice. I'm not saying I was good at it, but I was practicing the whole time, trying to imagine them getting that job that I wanted, that we were both competing for, and being happy for them and celebrating with them even. If I could have done that, I succeeded sometimes, I failed other times. If I could have done that, that would have been more generous of me. I would have been a better person for doing that, for taking that sort of pleasure in someone else's benefit. Here's a really interesting one. You might think that's all well and good, but certainly virtue is not going to change just the simple way you perceive the world. But it does, according to Aristotle, according to people in his tradition. If you're truly generous, you actually look at the world a different way. You recognize things that non-generous people don't. If you're truly generous, if you're truly wanting other people to be benefited, over time, you're going to learn to recognize things that someone who is not generous wouldn't recognize. You'll recognize the signs, maybe, of chronic hunger or chronic fatigue or something like that, or of homelessness, right? There are obvious signs, and then there are unobvious signs. And if you're not generous, you don't care about those other people and their benefit. You're not going to be learning or looking to learn what it looks like. But if you're really generous and you really want people to do well, to be benefited, you're going to want to learn what it looks like. You're going to want to learn to recognize the signs, and you're going to get better at doing that. You're going to pick out things. You're going to see things that someone walking behind you on the same sidewalk won't see even, right? So think about, in the most kind of blatant of cases, what people describe happens to them on the inside when they move to big cities. They initially see the homeless people. They're deeply disturbed by the homeless people. They recognize them as being in need, and eventually they just become deadened on the inside to that because they see it so frequently. This happened to me a little bit when I moved to Austin. I lived there for 3 years. There's a lot of homelessness in Austin, and you just kind of like scab over on the inside. You stop recognizing the need. And I think that's one of the bad things that cities do to people. They make people less generous in that way. So it also affects your hopes and your fears. You hope that someone's needs will be satisfied. I don't know if I'm sure y'all have experienced this too. When one of your friends or family members is going through something, some sort of hurt, you find yourself hoping, right, on a daily basis for them. It's a great experience to have. It's horrible that you have to have it because it means that someone near you is hurting, but it draws you out of yourself. You're hoping that they will be satisfied, that they will get what they need. Obviously affects your choices. That's the most obvious case of generosity, when you choose to give to someone of your resources. And there's shock and dismay even. I mean, your reactions, your very gut level reactions. This is another really surprising one. A truly virtuous person, it is not all a matter of choice in the end. Of course, when you start to try to become virtuous, it is choice laden, so to speak. There is lots of decisions that you're making. But by the end, you have so cultivated a virtue that it even governs your involuntary reactions. A truly virtuous person doesn't have to think or work themselves up into shock and dismay when they see hunger or poverty. It happens involuntarily, even though it wouldn't in some cases for an unvirtuous or an ungenerous person. So that's just one case of a virtue. What I wanted to do is like take that case study and work through all the different ways that generosity, true generosity, will pervade your character, your attitudes, your choices, what you take pleasure in, what you want, what you value, your very reactions, your very perceptions of the world. And this, Aristotle says, is why virtue is so important. We're missing out on this when we focus just on what we should and shouldn't do in the world, how we shouldn't and shouldn't act. Okay, so you might be wondering, look, we just looked at one virtue in depth, but surely there are other virtues besides generosity, and that's true. Now, we can disagree on the exact list of the virtues, and sure, I'm fixing to show y'all Aristotle's list of the virtues and vices. He's got some that will make perfect sense to you. He's got some which you might not even recognize the word. The more important point that I'm trying to drive home is the importance of virtue. And again, it's a distinct point from that to argue about what the virtues are. We can probably agree on some and then maybe disagree on some. So let's move to that next stage of talking about what the virtues might be. So here's Aristotle's list of the virtues. Now, Aristotle, again, for every virtue, there's at least one vice, right? If you talk about generosity, what's the opposite of generosity? That's its vice. You would call it stinginess, maybe. Well, Aristotle didn't think exactly that way. He actually thought that for each virtue, there are actually two vices, because he thought each virtue was a mean and a middle ground between two excesses. So take courage, for example. Courage is a virtue. It's good. It's a virtuous thing to be courageous. But you could go wrong in two different ways with regard to courage. You can actually, the more common one is to be cowardly. But another way to go wrong with regard to courage is to be rash. So you could think about that in just in a bunch of different ways, but think about it in terms of your willingness to risk danger. That's one thing that courage is centrally about. A cowardly person is not willing enough to risk danger to themselves. But a rash person is too willing to risk danger to themselves. A courageous person is willing enough, but not too willing to risk danger to themselves, right? So Aristotle would say you might have this kind of cartoonish picture of courage in your head as willing to sacrifice your life for anything, for any good cause, in any situation. But Aristotle says, well, no, think about a case where you're in a trench. Say, again, the sort of paradigm cases of courage are in battle, military conflict. And so if you're in the infantry and you're pinned down by a sniper or just enemy gunfire, would it be courageous to pop out of that trench and take a run at the enemy line? Well, wait till you got the facts. Here are the other facts. You've got air support coming in very shortly, and it's got a really high rate of success and a very low risk to you or anybody in the plane. And so, yeah, you could take a run at those enemy positions, and you've got a very low chance of success and a very high chance of death, or at least severe injury. So is it courageous to risk your life in that case? Aristotle would say no. It's actually rash. That's a vice. That would be a vice if you did that in that case. You actually should be valuing your life more than that. So courage is not, in Aristotle's view, just being willing to make any sacrifice whatsoever. It's being willing to risk certain sacrifices, right? It's being willing to risk just the right sacrifices for the right causes. Okay, so we could walk through these. It would take a long time, and I'm aiming at a shorter video here. So let me pick out a few more. We talked about generosity. You could actually see how in this case there are two vices with regard to generosity. Aristotle calls cheapskateness illiberality. That's kind of an old school term, but what he means is being a cheapskate, being a tightwad. But on the other hand, you could imagine giving away too freely of your resources, right? You don't want to say there's such a thing as being generous to a fault, right? If you give away so much, imagine me giving away so many of my resources that my family cannot be fed anymore, and we're kicked out of our house, and it's the foreclosed upon by the bank or whatever. I would be giving away more than I do now, but I wouldn't be more generous. I'd be an idiot. I would be what Aristotle calls prodigal, being too freely giving of my resources. Now, what's interesting about this list is, look, there's some ones that are kind of hard to make sense of just in terms of language, but once you get through the language, they make sense. Magnanimity is sort of like a proper view of yourself. You could have vanity, thinking too highly of yourself, or pusillanimity. Oh my gosh, that one's even hard to say. Pusillanimity. There we go. Pusillanimous is the adjective form of that word. That would be like thinking too lowly of yourself, basically. And you could make sense of magnanimity in that sense being a virtue. Magnificence, you might wonder, what is that? Well, that's sort of like Aristotle had this weird category. It's sort of like generosity, but on a bigger scale. Like if you're a really rich person. So it's kind of strange that the virtue there would only apply to those with great means. What's interesting is when you get towards the bottom of this list, you get a little bit more controversial, and it kind of says something interesting about Aristotle's view of society, because what you get down here are sort of, at least with wittiness, friendliness, modesty. I'm thinking of those three. Righteous indignation might not be quite like this, but those three, wittiness, friendliness, modesty, are more like social qualities, right? Why would wittiness be a moral virtue? Right? It doesn't seem like generosity. We're not thinking, that's not the way we think. You're a more morally virtuous person the wittier you are. Same with friendliness and modesty. Modesty, maybe not quite so much, at least if you come from a sort of background, more conservative, more religious background, you might be more inclined to think of modesty as a moral virtue. And there's definitely grounds to that. But yeah, so I guess I'm focusing on wittiness and friendliness. So why would those things be virtues? Well, sort of my gut level speculation is that maybe Aristotle views society in a different way than we do. That society or your community, being in a community of other people, might be for him far more important to one's moral character and upbringing and education than we tend to think it is. Especially in today's day and age in America, we tend to be sort of individualistic, consumeristic, and think about the way our houses work. Even our houses are not places of community as much as they are places of consumption. We go to our houses to consume the goods that we've bought on the market. And houses are built now increasingly large so that each person can be their own little unit of consumption. They can have their own little bedroom where they go away from the other people in the house. And they can have what's truly good life on the American view, which is isolation from others, individualism. Okay, you can tell that I might be a little more on Aristotle's side here, because Aristotle, what this list of virtues seems to indicate, especially these social virtues, is that society and being in community with others is actually a very deep part of the good life for us. So much so that how you behave in society, even in conversation in society, could be governed by a moral virtue, because that society is so deeply important to the goodness of your life.